How do I start a podcast? Where to even begin? Well, good thing you're listening to this podcast. Let's get going. Welcome to Geelong Podcasters, your weekly podcast for tips and tricks to grow your audience. We are a group of passionate podcasters located in Geelong and the Bellarine in Victoria, Australia. If you're down our way at the end of the month, why not come to one of our free monthly meetup events? And also, find the booking links and more in the show notes. Starting a podcast is like starting any other hobby or marketing plan for your business. Whatever you're doing a podcast for, you have to have a reason, hopefully, and you need to do a few things first. You need to plan your content, plan what you're doing for the podcast. You need to gather your equipment to record and edit the podcast, and you need to be able to, in turn, record and edit the podcast ready for distribution. So I'm going to go through those three sections throughout this podcast episode: planning your content, gathering your equipment, and recording and editing. And I want to stress that this episode is part of a longer series of episodes that we are doing about the basic questions that we have about podcasting. So if you have any questions yourself, make sure you reach out on our website and fill in the FAQ form on our website to ask your questions, and I'll make sure to answer it in the podcast. So starting off with number one, planning your content. Make sure that you actually research podcasting. It helps greatly if you actually listen to one or two, or in my case, many podcasts on a regular basis to get a feel of why podcasting works and works for your audience. Again, the reason that you're doing a podcast may not be because you like it, but because your audience prefers their content that way. And the way that you do that is you do research. You ask, if you're doing it for a business, you ask your clients and how they get their marketing and their content and how they're influenced. If it's just a hobby, then ask people who are interested in the same hobby as you, where are you getting your information? And if it's podcasts, what type of podcasts are they listening to? Decide on the format, ultimately, on how you're actually doing the podcast. Is it going to be an interview-based podcast? Or are you going to sit there by yourself talking about a recent news event or update in your industry or niche? Or are you planning to do, very much like myself, short bite-sized pieces of content to help your audience or your community grow in their preferred niche? I'm saying niche a lot. And also decide on your episode structure. Very much like myself in this podcast that you're listening to, we have both an intro and an outro, and I am able to talk like I am now in the middle of that. And essentially, this makes it easier for me to be able to record and process and output podcasts quicker and easier, because I don't have to worry about re-recording things again and again, because I've already got a set structure with these podcast episodes. Now that you've thought a bit more about why you're doing a podcast and possibly done some research into what your audience needs and what your listener needs ultimately at the end of the day, because you are doing a podcast for them, not for yourself, you are doing it for them. Now it is time to gather your equipment. Your equipment can be something as simple as a mobile phone and a doona cover. For those who are not in Australia, a doona cover is your bed sheet, or a nice thick bed sheet that you put over yourself and record straight into your phone. Now, you might ask, Zoe, why the doona cover? Why the thick blanket? Because that reduces the amount of sound and echo that could impact your overall recording. And I'm going to tell you now that most people, you're probably even listening to this on a mobile phone. So you definitely have the equipment to start a podcast today. But the things that I recommend looking into or researching for a podcast is a good quality microphone. You can get microphones realistically as cheap as $20, $25. And of course, you have much more expensive microphones. But if you are starting out this process, I do recommend going for something as simple as a Blue Yeti. The quality isn't great, but you can plug in and go. And that's ultimately what we need at the end of the day. I also recommend, if you are going to look into podcasting and podcasting long term, that you look into headphones, and good quality headphones, anywhere between the $100 to $150 range and about $60 to $90 in the US. And I recommend looking at recording software. So for example, I use a program called Audacity because it is quick, it is easy, and it is free to use, and it is open source. So research those as you can. And I'm running out of time here, but essentially the last step is to record and edit your podcast. The first episode is going to be shit. I'm going to tell you that now, is going to be terrible. But that is okay. You are starting, you are learning, you are growing. And what you're going to do? You are going to research, you are going to keep growing, you are going to edit them for clarity, and you are going to be able to look back or listen back and get a better idea of what you need to do your podcast. Hopefully this helps. Bye. This podcast is sponsored by me, Zoe, the Video Confidence Coach, connecting the dots of your personal brand with the power of video. See more in the show notes. Speaking of show notes, see all the show notes, including links, upcoming events, and details for this episode and many more in the episode description, or just go to vcc.training/Geelong-podcasters. Make sure you tune in for next week.